You're standing in a conference room across from two attorneys and a forensic accountant, and the folder in front of you has your name on it next to the word misrepresentation, typed in a font that feels deliberately calm given what it's about to do to your life. 14 months ago, you had $9.2 million in the bank and a board that believed in you. Today, you have a laptop, a subpoena, and a founder story that's about to be told very differently than the one you used to tell on stage. To understand how you got here, you have to go back to the pitch deck that started all of it. You're 29, 2 years out of a mid-level product job, running on savings, and a conviction that the logistics software you've been building nights and weekends solves a real problem nobody's solved well yet. You raise a $1.4 million seed, round off a demo, a spreadsheet of projected customers who haven't actually signed anything, and a founder story investors like. Bootstrap grit, a chip on your shoulder, the kind of energy that reads as inevitability in a pitch meeting even when the product barely works. Your friend Marcus, who you met in that same product job, starts his own company around the same time, a much smaller, boring inventory tool, funded almost entirely by his own savings and one small angel check. He tells you, half joking, that he's scared of other people's money. Scared of what it does to how you make decisions once it's not just your risk anymore. You laugh it off. Other people's money is the whole point, you tell him. That's called leverage. The seed money hits your account, and something in your brain shifts almost immediately. Money that used to be yours to protect becomes money that exists to be deployed, and deploying it fast starts to feel like the actual job, more urgent than the product itself. You hire 11 people in 4 months, most of them before you have a single paying customer at scale. Your monthly burn goes from $18,000 to $210,000, practically overnight. You tell your board this is normal, that you're buying speed, buying a head start on a market that's about to get crowded. For a while, the story holds, because a competitor announces a smaller raise, and your investors get nervous in exactly the way that makes them want you to move faster, not slower. You sign a lease on an office you don't need yet, because investors, you've noticed, take you more seriously in a room with a logo on the wall than in the co-working space you started in. The math stops making sense the moment your burn rate outpaces your actual revenue growth by a factor of 6. Nobody in the room says that sentence out loud, including you. 10 months in, revenue is real but small. $340,000 in annual recurring revenue against a burn rate that's now consuming close to $2.5 million a year. Your runway, the number that's supposed to tell you how many months you have left before the company dies, keeps shrinking every time you look at it, so you stop looking at it as often. Marcus's inventory tool crosses profitability in month 9. Nothing dramatic. Just steady, unglamorous growth funded by customers instead of investors. He tells you over drinks that he sleeps better than he expected to, given how small everything still is. You tell him small is exactly the problem, that he's optimizing for comfort instead of scale. He doesn't argue. He just asks, gently, what happens to you if the next round doesn't close on time? You don't have a good answer. You notice that you don't. You order another drink instead of sitting with it. Your Series A conversations start 8 months later than they should have, because you spent the first 6 months of that window telling your board you weren't ready to raise yet, when the truth was closer to being afraid of what a real due diligence process would find. When you finally do go out to raise, the metrics you present are technically true and functionally misleading. ARR, that includes contracts still in the sales pipeline. Customer counts that include free trial users who never converted. A churn number calculated over a shorter window than industry standard, specifically because the standard window looks worse. Nobody at the table asks the follow-up question that would unravel it, because the story you're telling is exactly the story growth stage investors want to hear in a hot market. And wanting something to be true is its own kind of blindness. You close a $9.8 million Series A. You tell yourself this is the buffer that finally lets you build the real numbers underneath the story you've been telling. That the exaggeration was temporary. A bridge, not a foundation. You don't tell yourself because you can't quite let yourself hear it yet. That bridges built on numbers that don't exist tend to collapse under exactly the weight they're meant to carry. 8 months after the Series A closes, the real revenue still hasn't caught up to the story. Your burn, instead of slowing down the way you promised your new board members it would, climbs again. A new head of growth at $340,000 a year. A rebrand nobody asked for. A company retreat in Tulum that costs more than your entire first year of payroll. Cash is disappearing at close to $700,000 a month against real revenue of roughly $180,000 a month. And the runway you present in board meetings no longer matches the runway sitting in your actual bank statements, because you've started quietly moving numbers between categories to make the burn look more controlled than it is. Reclassifying marketing spend as capitalized software development. Pushing vendor payments into the following quarter so they don't show up in the current one's expenses. None of it is dramatic on its own. Each adjustment, individually, looks like the kind of aggressive but defensible accounting a scrappy startup does under pressure. Together, over 6 months, they add up to a set of board reports that describe a company that doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did. Marcus asks you, during one of the last normal dinners you'll have with him for a long time, how the numbers are actually looking. Not the pitch deck version. The real one. You tell him they're tight, but manageable. He looks at you for a beat too long. The way someone looks at a friend they suspect is lying, but aren't ready to call out directly. He tells you, almost offhand, that his own company just crossed $1.1 million in annual revenue, entirely self-funded. No board to report to. No story to maintain, except the truth. You feel something sharp and uncomfortable when he says it. Something closer to shame than jealousy. You don't let yourself name it that night. A new board member, brought on during the Series A specifically because of his background in operations, starts asking for raw financial data instead of the summarized reports your CFO has been preparing. Bank statements. Actual vendor invoices. Unfiltered revenue by customer rather than aggregated ARR. You stall for 3 weeks, citing a system migration that doesn't exist. When the data finally comes through, the gap between the story and the actual numbers is impossible to explain away as aggressive accounting. Real ARR is closer to $610,000, not the $2.1 million presented at the last board meeting. Cash on hand is $410,000 against monthly burn of $700,000. Roughly 18 days of runway instead of the 8 months comfortably you told the board 6 weeks earlier. The board calls an emergency session. Your CFO, facing his own liability, cooperates fully with the outside forensic accountant they bring in within 72 hours. You are removed as CEO by unanimous board vote before the meeting even formally ends. Within a month, 2 of your Series A investors file suit alleging securities fraud, specifically the misrepresentation of revenue and reserves used to induce their investment. You don't go to prison. The settlement, reached after 11 months of legal proceedings that consume what's left of your personal savings, involves a permanent officer and director bar preventing you from running or serving on the board of any venture-backed company again, along with a civil judgment you'll be paying off for years. The company itself, the thing you built and then slowly hollowed out from the inside, gets sold for parts to a competitor for less than the total amount originally invested in it. The 11 people you hired in that first frantic burst of hiring are laid off inside of a week, most of them finding out through a mass email rather than a conversation. Marcus is the only person from that period of your life who still returns your calls. He doesn't gloat, doesn't bring up the dinner where he asked you the question you lied about. He just shows up, the same way he always has, with 2 coffees and no agenda, and sits with you in the parking lot of the office you don't have access to anymore while the movers carry out furniture you bought with money that was never really yours to spend the way you spent it. He tells you, eventually, the thing he's been sitting on for a while, that he never thought you were a bad person, just someone who mistook other people's belief in you for permission to stop telling the truth. He says the version of you at the seed stage, before the burn rate and the reclassified expenses, is still in there somewhere. And that rebuilding trust, his and everyone else's, starts with becoming boring again on purpose, the way he chose to be from the beginning. Roughly 70% of venture-backed startups fail to return investor capital, and only a small fraction of those failures ever involve outright fraud. Most founders who burn through their runway simply run out of belief at the same time as they run out of money. No lawsuits required. You were never forced into what happened to you. Every adjustment, every reclassified expense, every optimistic number in a board deck was a choice made by someone who could have said the truth out loud instead, and didn't. You think about that seed stage version of yourself sometimes, standing in a co-working space with a demo that barely worked, and nothing to protect yet but your own name. He believed the product was enough. You spent 4 years proving, expensively, that it might have been, if you'd just been willing to let it stay small enough to be honest. This isn't the comeback story investors like to fund, but it's the only version of the story that's actually true. And most days, telling it straight is enough.